Morning. We are on Memvav Medalef 46a, and where it says Gimel Mem in big large letters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the top. We concluded the Mishnah now with the Gemara's analysis. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the law in the Mishnah that describes the calf that is supposed to be brought for the process of Egla Rufa, the one that's decapitated by the river. Specifically, the fact that it says there, it has to be, well, Egla, calf, by Torah law means, by Torah definition means it's under 1 year old. It's within the first year. That's number one. The Mishnah didn't state that, but that's our understanding from the verse itself. And number two, no work was ever done with it. And number three, it's allowed to have a blemish. A blemish is not rendered invalid. Compared to the red heifer, where it can be older, it doesn't have to be within a year. It may not have a blemish, and also no work on it. So they're equal only with regard to the fact that both of them are to have never been worked. And even within that, there's a difference, as we're going to learn presently. But right now, the only commonality between Egla Rufa, the calf of the Egla Rufa, and the cow of the Porah Aduma is that both may never have been worked. Age is different. Egla Rufa under a year, and Porah Aduma doesn't matter. And when it comes to mum, also distinction. For Porah Aduma, if it has a mum, it's invalid. If it has a blemish, it's invalid. Whereas Egla Rufa, if it has a mum, we don't care. It still remains valid. So it's working. Yeah. Okay, that's where we are. Now we're going to zero in for a moment on the similarity that they're both it's forbidden to have done any work with either of them. And there's a subtle distinction. Now, this distinction comes from the different phrasings in the verse. When the pasuk describes the no work of the Porah Aduma, and the way the pasuk describes the no work of the Egla Rufa are a bit different. Now, what the exercise the Gemara is going to do is, the Gemara is going to go through an exercise in which the Egla Rufa and the Porah Aduma are to be compared, and where they're not to be compared. Which words in the verse associate the two to each other, and thus we can learn laws from each other, and which words in the verse are to be seen as distinct from each other, separating the Porah Aduma from the Egla Rufa. Yeah? So let's look at the verse. You have it.
That way, it's important to know whether or not you can derive laws.
That's correct. But they can from one to the other. It's correct. Yeah. So and at the end, hopefully, when we see all the clear distinctions between them, perhaps we'll explain them in light of what we said yesterday, but from Chassidus, the difference. And that the Porah Aduma is to elevate the outside, elevate the negative that's outside, whereas the Egla Rufa is to cast away the negative that's on the outside. So there's distinction there. That's something we discussed yesterday. So you can find the verse on the page there. If you give it to me for a second, I'll show you. On the left-hand side of the page, it's the pasuk Beis and Gimel. On the left margin there, you see a little Beis and a Gimel. Beis and Gimel, those are the two verses they were looking at.
Okay.
So first, let's look at Beis, right? The Beis one. The second verse is the verse about. What does it read there? The first word.
Zot.
Yeah. So the first verse there, number 2 on your page, is a pasuk from Bamidbar, chapter 19, verse 2, which describes the law of the Porah Aduma, the red heifer. So verse 1 is, you don't have that verse on your page, but it's by God says to Moshe and Aaron saying, okay, now here's the verse you have. Zois Chukas HaTorah. This is the law of Torah. Asher Tziva Hashem, which God commands, Lemar, to say as follows. Dabar b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people. God's telling this to Moshe and Aaron. V'yikchu elacha, and you shall take or they shall take. For you, para aduma timima, a perfect red cow, perfect red heifer. Asher ein bamum, upon which there is no blemish. Asher, right? That's the right. Sorry.
No, because I was thinking it says perfect and then no blemish. It seems like a redundancy.
Yeah, so perhaps the Gemara will get. I didn't get far enough in the Gemara to know if the Gemara discusses that, but I imagine elsewhere probably it does. I can see. Yeah, Rashi explained that the word tamima, perfect, takes us from the Sifri. Tamima, perfect means perfect in its redness, whereas no blemish means no blemish, literally. Yeah, so there you go. Here's the main point. Asher lo'ala aleha oil, upon which no yoke was laid. That's the wording here. Now, let's compare it to the next verse. Go to the next verse. What does it say there? V'haya ha'ir ha'krova el ha'chalal, and it should be the city that's closest to the corpse. This is the Eglah Rufa law now. We're in Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 21. V'haya ha'ir ha'krova el ha'chalal, and it should be the city that's closest to the corpse. The Lakhu Ziknei Ha'ir, and the elders of the city shall take, Hahi of that city, Eglas Bakar, a calf of cattle, calf meaning under 1 year, Asher loy ubudba, with which no work has been done, Asher loy moshcha ba'ol, that has never drawn a yoke. So what's the difference between this and the wording of the paraduma? What it's about paraduma? Asher loy Allah oil, upon which a yoke was never placed. So first of all, it only says yoke. Number two, it doesn't say you did anything with it. It just says it was placed. When it comes to the Eglah Rufa, it says with which no work has been done, not limiting it to yoke, but any work. And number two, it says which has not been drawn by a yoke. Not just that you placed it upon it. You see the difference? Two differences. One more strict, one more lenient. The lenient here is that it has to be worked and it has to be drawn by Eglah Rufa. It has to be worked and it has to be drawn. Whereas a paraduma, it's stringent, where it says even if it's placed on the neck, Allah oil was placed. Conversely, when it comes to the Eglah Rufa, what does it say? It says any work. When it comes to the paraduma, it says only yoke. It only says the word yoke. Clear? Mm-hmm. So now with that information, let's read the Gemara. And we'll see how the Gemara tells us which areas we can compare them to each other and derive laws from each other and which areas you can't. Yeah? Make sure this is clear. We're clear on this distinction here?
Yeah. Thinking about the ages of the animals too.
Put the age aside for a second.
No, I know.
We're going to come back to the age. We're going to come back to the age in a second. But let's look at this difference. The Gemara is going to introduce us to the age in 1 second. But before we get to that, let's make sure we understand the difference in the wording of the verse.
Yes,
before the Gemara is there.
And they both share.
Yes, but before we get to the Gemara's analysis as to what to be compared, not compared, let's just look at the verses themselves. If we had no derivation, if we had no derivations from each other, what would we conclude? We would conclude that a paraduma is forbidden only if it has a yoke. If you put a saddle, no problem. You put a sack of potatoes, also no problem. That's what you would conclude if you just read the verse, because it says yoke, number one. Number two, if you placed it on it, but it didn't walk, you put the yoke on the cow, it didn't walk, by paraduma, you would say it's forbidden. Because it says, Allah, no yoke was placed on it. So it didn't walk, but it was just placed on it. Still invalid. But if you put a sack of potatoes in it, you walked them around for a week, no problem. Because it doesn't say anything about anything else other than yoke. That's what you can assume had you just read the verse without the Gemara's derivations. Yeah? Conversely, Eglah Rufa, what would you conclude? If Eglah Rufa, you conclude any work, because it says, Asher lo ubadba, nothing was worked with it. So if you put a sack of potatoes and you walked around with it, it would be forbidden because it says any work. Now, when it does add the word yoke, But there it says it wasn't drawn by a yoke, which means for the egla rufa, you would assume it has to actually have done work. If you placed something on it and then took it off, but didn't walk, no work was done, it's still valid. That's what you would assume before the Gemara's derivations, just by learning the scripture. Because there's a distinction, and there's a distinction in how it's expressed. By egla rufa, the stress is work, any work, yoke or otherwise, movement. It says you're drawn by the yoke, so there's movement there, there's work there. When it comes to paraduma, it only says yoke, but the emphasis there is placed on it. No, it doesn't say anything about movement. No yoke was placed on it, which means work is not the issue, it's just yoke on it. If it did work that wasn't associated with the yoke, no problem. Again, only if you just read scripture itself without the Gemara's derivations. Now that we have that, let's go to the Gemara and see the actual derivations, because the law is going to change based on the derivations. Yeah, we're clear?
Yeah.
Okay. So now the Gemara introduces, to your point, the first suggested derivation, which is rejected actually, is from the age. Why the age? Says the Gemara. V'yehi mum poisel ba'agala. Let a blemish invalidate the egla rufa, the decapitated calf. Why? The verse doesn't say anything about blemish in the case of the decapitated calf. It only says, with regard to work, it doesn't say anything about blemish. So why should I conclude that it should be invalid by a blemish? Yes? Quite clear question. Says the Gemara, Mikavah Chaimer, from a how much to the more so. It's one of the principles, the 13 principles of Torah derivation, as we read them every morning before Haidu. The 13 principles of derivation. One of them is Kavah Chaimer. Isn't it the first one? Kavah Chaimer Gzei Shava, right? It's the first one. Yeah, it's the first one. Kavah Chaimer means literally, Kal means light, Chomer means stringent. I think Mr. Michael Chernak, of blessed memory, taught me the word a fortiori. A fortiori. It's a Latin word for Kavah Chaimer, apparently. He was a lawyer, so you just think. But I think the best way in English is how much to the more so. Which means if something of a lenient nature has a stringency, then something else which is more stringent to begin with certainly would incorporate the stringency that the lenient guy has. As a kid, I had a teacher who used a shirt that I had to demonstrate the point. I had this shirt where half was light blue and half was dark blue. Okay. So he said, okay, put your hands up, lady. Yeah. So you have this side's dark shirt, dark blue, and this is light blue. If we never saw your hand on the light side, but we saw your hand on the dark blue shirt that had one finger that was light blue, we can safely assume that the one that to begin with was light blue definitely had that light blue finger. If the dark one has light blue finger, then certainly the light side will have a light blue finger. That's the way he visualized it for us. That's how much the more so. If that which is strict has a leniency, then certainly that which is to begin with is lenient has a leniency. That's actually a chum of a cow. Or in reverse, if something which is lenient has a stringency, how much more so the stringent one to begin with has that stringency. It's one of the principles of the Torah derivation. If that's the case, let's apply that logic to the paraduma and the egla rufa as regard to a blemish. Namely, umma para, just as it is when it comes to a red heifer, which seems to be more lenient. In what regard is it more lenient? She'ein hashanim poiselasba. Age is of no factor here. Whereas when it comes to the decapitated calf, the egla rufa, Torah says egla, a calf, which means age is a factor. So if we just look at the question of age, the egla rufa is more strict than the paraduma. And yet, mum poiselba, the more lenient one, the paraduma, which we don't care about age, nonetheless, Torah gives it a stringency that the blemish invalidates it. Then the egla rufa, sheshanim poiselasba, which to begin with is more stringent because age is a factor and it has to be under 1 year old. Ein adin, is it not therefore logical sheyehei mum poiselba that the blemish should invalidate it? So looking from this perspective, the egla rufa seems to be the more stringent one. How's that? Because when it comes to the work issue, it's a wash. Even though there's a difference in how the Torah phrases the work, the forbidden nature of the working by Egla Rufa and the forbidden nature of working by the Paraduma, but nonetheless, we can look at them as equal, and it's a wash. They both have the same level of disregard or no work. Whatever type of work it is, we'll get into the details of that. And we just discussed a little bit earlier. That's a wash. So let's look at other factors. Well, Egla Rufa, we're strict about the age. Paraduma, we're not strict about the age. Okay, so Egla Rufa is to begin with more strict. And yet, when it comes to the more lenient one, the Paraduma, for which age is not a factor, we still say blemish is a factor. So then how much of the more so in the more strict one, the Egla Rufa, where age is a factor, how much more so blemish should be an issue? Clear?
I didn't follow that, sorry.
The Paraduma, which is more lenient, because we don't care about age is not a factor, and yet Torah says blemish is a factor. So Egla Rufa, where age is a factor, which means it's more strict than the Paraduma, how much more so it should have the strictness of making blemish a factor? Is that not logical? Even though the Mishnah told us that blemish is not a factor in Egla Rufa. The Gemara is challenging that and saying, why aren't you applying the rule of Kal V'chomer? Yeah. Says the Gemara, here's the reason why we can't apply the rule. Shiny Hasam, the issue of blemish being a factor for Parah Aduma is not available for Kal V'chomer. It's not available for Kal V'chomer. Why is that? Because the Amar Kra, here's how the verse phrases the fact that it may not have a blemish. Quote, Asher ein ba mum, in which it doesn't have a blemish. That word it says only it has an issue of blemish. Nothing else, don't make any derivations. The word it precludes you from making a Kal V'chomer, because the word it constricts that law to be here and here only. Ba mum paisel, in it does a blemish have invalidated. The ein mum paisel ba'egla, but the mum does not apply elsewhere, namely to the Egla Rufa.
So when,
Clear?
Yeah. So when the verses talk about offerings in the temple,
There too, it says don't have
the
no mum.
sages don't cite to Paraduma.
No. They have their own verses, yeah.
They have their own verses.
They have their own verses. They have their own verses when it comes to them, right? It's in the beginning of Vayikra.
Imagine so. I don't know them offhand.
I believe it's there.
No,
It's the beginning of Vayikra. Look it up. Okay, so now we understand why we can't be Kal V'chomer. Because when the Torah tells us that law about a mum, a blemish, invalidating a Paraduma, it says it shall not have a blemish, and therefore don't derive anything from anywhere else. Because don't use this as a derivation somewhere else. Because we're telling you it's it and it only. It could have said, take a cow that has no blemish. In it is not a relevant word. You're adding in it, you're telling me to exclude anything else, because it's in it only. Right? Look at the pasuk on the side there, the pasuk in Numbers. Take a whole red heifer, asher ein mum, that has no blemish, without the word ba, without the word in it.
So if it didn't have the word it, you could
then you could say extrapolate to anything you want, because it's laying down a principle, and therefore you can use Kal V'chomer to derive somewhere else, because it says in it means it and nothing else. There. Now says the Gemara, that's the case, then we have to look at these very same words, these same verses, the two verses we're talking about, the verse of the Egla Rufa and the verse of the Paraduma, and see if wherever it says it, that means you can't derive one to the other. That's what it would mean.
you have to find a case.
What we do,
If you do.
right here we do, namely the words in Egla Rufa. Look at the verse there, the second verse you have. Asher loy ubad ba. It, there was no work done in it. You see that word?
Yeah.
In this is describing the lack of work required for the Egla Rufa. It, which means the issue of work being an invalidating factor should be exclusive to the egla rufa. But we know, as a matter of fact, that's not the case. I told you before that if you were to just read scripture without the Gemara derivation, what would you conclude? That the paraduma, if you did work, it's not a problem. It's only a question of putting a yoke on, right? But the Gemara elsewhere tells us, no. Just as by paraduma, Torah expands it beyond yoke, but also to any other work.
From where?
From egla rufa.
It has the it.
But it has the it. That's the Gemara's question. So how could you derive? You're telling me that it tells me don't derive. I have another it, and yet we didn't care about it, and we still derived.
Under the same principle.
Into the same,
Homer?
not a couple of actually by comparison, but it makes a difference. The point is, if you're saying in it, and in it means to exclude any other comparison, then it doesn't matter which principle you're using. You're overriding the word in it, which, according to what you just said, is a factor. So let's see how the Gemara phrases it, yeah? So Elamayata, if that's the case, then we should conclude, if the word ba, if the word in it excludes derivation to another law, then we should not invalidate the paraduma by any other work other than a yoke. Why? And if that's the case, and if that's the conclusion, why did Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rav tell us elsewhere that if you placed on the cow, the red heifer, a sacks of
Potatoes.
whatever, anything,
It's prohibited.
psula, it should be forbidden. Why? Because we derive from the fact that it says by egla rufa any work. But here's the funny thing. It's a very funny thing. We compare, and this is where the Gemara is going to get into a little like dicey territory now, which is the Gemara is going to like break down each word and each derivation. Yeah. On the one hand, we derive from egla rufa. This is what Rabbi Yehuda is telling us in the name of Rav, that any work just like any work invalidates the paraduma, the egla rufa, so too any work invalidates the paraduma.
Based on the egla.
Based on the egla rufa. But by paraduma, it doesn't say work. What does it say? It says placed on it.
That's the limitation.
Which therefore, if you place the sack of potatoes on the paraduma, even if you didn't do any work, it's still invalid. So you end up deriving from egla rufa and becoming more strict than egla rufa. You derive from egla rufa that it's not only a yoke, it's anything. But you apply that principle that it's anything to the thinking of paraduma, which is even if it's placed on it. So you actually derive from egla rufa and become more strict than egla rufa. Follow?
How is it more strict than egla rufa?
Because paraduma says if you placed on the yoke,
yes,
even if you didn't walk.
That's the stringency.
That's right. Now, if you're going to bring from egla rufa that the issue of work applies to not just yoke, but to anything, then you hold that anything standard, not to the egla rufa standard, but to paraduma standard. And paraduma standard is, it doesn't have to be work, it's even if it's placed. So we derive from egla rufa and become more strict than egla rufa. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Now, to your thinking, that the word ba precludes derivation, when it says no work by egla rufa, it says in it. So why are you applying a derivation? And not just applying a derivation that becomes more strict.
Yeah,
What's going on?
that's an oddity.
It's an oddity, certainly, especially if you're going to follow the principle of ba in it.
That too is one issue. And now you have this
That's right.
issue of making something more strict than the source.
That's correct. And that's what Rabbi Yehuda concludes here in the name of Rav. Uba'agala, when it comes to egla rufa, achatimshech, you have to actually pull it. So when it comes to egla, egla rufa, you have to do actual work. Because the Torah says no work was done on it, and you didn't pull it on a yoke. So it has to be actual work.
Right.
But we take that issue of expanding yoke to any work to apply to paraduma, and over there, it doesn't have to do any work, even if it's placed on it. So put a sack of potatoes on the cow, invalid for paraduma, for egla rufa. For paraduma. For egla rufa, it's not a problem until you pull it. So you walk. Right? Okay. So here's our question. The word ba means to exclude derivation, where it says by egla rufa that no work should be done. It says like ubad ba, no work was done in it, and that should exclude applying that standard to paraduma, even though you raise the standard there in paraduma, but you shouldn't even apply it at all. Certainly not raise it. Yeah, clear? Says the Gemara, no. The reason why we override the ba is because shiny para has a different standard. The para duma, different standard of derivation. Why? The alfinon oil me'egla rufa. There's another principle that's at play here. Like you were asking, which principle are we using? When it came to deriving no blemish for the egla rufa, we wanted to apply the rule of kal v'chomer. And that rule we excluded because it says in it, right? But which rule are we using by deriving no work to paraduma from egla rufa? Which rule are we using? And let's see if that rule can override the paraduma, can override the word ba. And which rule is that? It's the second rule, gzera shava. The second rule, the 13 principles, kal v'chomer and gzera shava. The second rule is gzera shava. What's gzera shava? We learned this before. Gzera shava is when two sets of laws share the same word. Now, then that means they teach each other laws. Now, you cannot do this cross-board. You cannot just open up any two verses and say, hey, I see two words the same. Let's start deriving laws. There is a traditional element in this part, which is that one has to have a tradition from his teacher to his teacher to his teacher, back to Moshe Rabbeinu, that there's a valid gzera shava here. The Gemara elsewhere discusses exactly what the tradition has to be. Does it have to be on the words? Does it have to be on the law? Does it have to be in the passages? And it could be actually a combination or variations of any. But you have to have a tradition that there's a derivation of a gzera shava in these laws. Which therefore means, what the Gemara is telling us, is if you have a gzera shava here, it's as if whatever is being compared actually is stated in the very verse. So whatever you're deriving from egla rufa to be applied to paraduma, it's as if it's actually written in paraduma. And with the fact that it says ba by egla rufa doesn't exclude anything else. Because the gzera shava makes as if it's written twice. Written once in egla rufa, and then again by paraduma. Kal v'chomer is not to say that the law you're saying here is written here. No, it's how much the more so. If it applies there, it also applies here. But because there's a ba, it excludes. But in the case of gzera shava, it's as if the same law is written twice. Once in egla rufa and another time in paraduma.
So does that mean you take the stringencies of both and apply both, and take the leniencies of both and apply?
Oh, now the Gemara is going to ask that the other way. That's going to be the next question, the Gemara. So if you're applying the stringent standard based on the gzera shava because the laws are written twice, why not apply it all the way around and apply it for mum also? Apply it for mum. Yeah, that we'll get to on Monday. But this is where we are right now. Where we are right now is that egla rufa, when it says, by paraduma, when it says no mum, it says in it, and in it means you cannot derive from anywhere else. When it comes to egla rufa, where it says not to work, even though it says in it, because we have the gzera shava to paraduma, it's as if that statement is stated by paraduma. And therefore paraduma also precludes not just yoke, but any work. But by its standard, which is not to even place any work on it.
It takes from egla rufa.
And insert the statement in itself. Through gzera shava. Yeah. And the gzera shava is,
gives to egla rufa
by kal v'chomer. And the word ba in it blocks the kal v'chomer. Because it's in it and nowhere else. That's right. That's correct. So the gzera shava does it. So the gzera shava takes from egla rufa and puts into paraduma. But paraduma cannot give to egla rufa and it cannot give a kal v'chomer because it says in it.
Right, it cannot.
And the problem is that they both say in it. So we'll have to figure that out. That we'll get to on Monday. And why the gzera shava doesn't go equally both directions. Because the words in it are applied to different things. So we'll get to that on Monday. But let's just conclude here. The shiny para, the paraduma issue, to say that the paraduma is invalid by any work on its own standard, meaning not even to place anything else. Yalfinon oil me'egla rufa. We learn a gzera shava because they both have the words oil, and we have a tradition that there's a gzera shava here, and therefore it's as if the statement, no work was done, that's written by egla rufa, it's as if that statement is written by paraduma, and therefore in paraduma, where it doesn't just say no work, it says no placing, then any placing is to be invalidated because it's as if the expansion of yoke to beyond yoke from egla rufa is stated in paraduma.
And that's how it gets a more stringent.
And that's how it gets that's right. And that's why even though it comes from derivation of Egla Rufa, it actually is being more stringent than Egla Rufa. Because it's not a derivation in the sense that I'm relying on what you're saying. It's I'm taking what you're saying and bringing it to me. Like, so if I take what you're saying and apply it to me, then I hold it by my standards.
It becomes incorporated.
It becomes exactly
of the Parah Duma.
That's right. So
but Parah Duma has its own words
exactly
to make it more
correct.
stringent.
So take the statement. It's an add-on. Take the expansion of yoke to beyond yoke to be anything, and insert that into Parah Duma. What do you get? Don't place anything on the Parah Duma. That's where we are right now. So on Monday, God willing, we're going to go the other direction. So why aren't we learning the other way as well? For all, if you have a Gzer Shava, in which the words of here are written there and the words of there are written here, we should have an equalized standard across the board for both of them, seemingly. And that's what the Gemara is going to have to do to tell us where the ba.
There's no blemish for Egla Rufa.
Exactly. Perhaps no. Exactly.
If you're going to use
that's
it
right.
Shava,
then why say no? Why not no blemish for?
No blemish.
That's right. That's right. So why is the ba precluding us from learning Egla Rufa to Parah Duma, but the ba does not preclude us from learning Parah Duma to Egla Rufa? That's going to come, God willing, on Monday, because the Gemara is going to tell us that if the ba is being used for something else, we cannot then again use it to block a derivation. It can only be used to block derivation if it's free of any other derivation. And therefore the ba blocks one direction, but not the other direction. Okay, God willing, on Monday. A wonderful day and good Shabbos. I want to mention at the beginning that this class is dedicated in Leila Nishmas to the memory of my late uncle, Reb Chaim Ben, to separate between life and life, my grandfather, Menachem Mendel, my late uncle, whose seventh yard site is today, my father's brother. So this learning is in his memory. A wonderful day and a good Shabbos.